Great. Well, welcome everybody. It is so great to have all of you here today. It is nice to be together for this very important topic, clinical trials and pay to participate. So this is really such an important topic today, one that is extremely relevant. And to help us discuss this important topic, we have this amazing group of panelists with us today, all experts in their field. We're going to enjoy having a great discussion. We welcome Arthur Kaplan, Nancy King, Susan Kornetsky, and Lee Turner. Thank you all for joining us today. And I'd like to give a special thanks to Alphamed Press, the publisher of Stem Cells Translational Medicine, and Ann Murphy, the executive director, for actually sponsoring this important session. So thank you all for being with us, and we look forward to spending the next hour and a half with you. So I guess we'll start off now with the topic straight out because our time is limited. So I'd like to welcome all our panelists again and start with our first question. I guess the first thing we need to do, of course, is try to define what is a pay-to-play trial? What are we really talking about? And maybe I'll ask one of our panelists, Susan Kornetsky, to actually go first in this question. And I'd like to welcome you, Susan. It's so nice to have you with us in this panel. I'd like to say a few words about Susan Kornetsky. Susan is actually the Senior Director of Clinical Research at Boston Children's Hospital.
These days seems to have some sort of social media presence, or at least an awareness of social media. So what you're seeing here when we work on internet investigations is trying to protect.
I'm going to have to ask
vulnerable victims.
Our manager to mute, please, anyone that's in the background. Thank you. Okay, I'll start again by introducing Susan Kornetsky. She's a Senior Director of Clinical Research Compliance at Boston Children's Hospital at Harvard Medical School for over 35 years. Her responsibilities have included directing an IRB administrative office, assuring institutional compliance with all federal and state regulation pertaining to human research, establishing appropriate policies and procedures, and overseeing a quality improvement program from human research protection. In May of 2010, she completed a medical ethics fellowship at Harvard Medical School. She serves on the Boston Children's Hospital Oversight Committee on Personalized Experimental Therapeutics and the steering committee of SMART IRB. She was on the board of directors and served as chair of PRIMER, the Public Responsibility in Medicine and Research, which is the leading international organization that helps establish the guidelines for human protection. She's a past member of the Department of Health and Human Services Secretary Advisory Committee on Human Research, and she has served as a co-chair for its subcommittee on children. She currently serves on its Subpart 8 subcommittee. She's a former member of the Institute of Medicine's Committee on Clinical Research involving children. Susan, so nice to have you with us today. Maybe you can start off by saying, what is a pay-to-participate trial?
Thank you, Dr. Atala, and everyone for joining. So I think this is an interesting concept because I think, the way that we are thinking about this in the particular issue that, has come up in journals and stem cells, I'd like to take a step back and basically say, if we term this a little bit differently, should an individual have to cover expenses to participate in research, how we think about that. And I think there's a spectrum. I think there's that we basically charge someone for everything. But I also want to point out that there's a lot of research that people do incur costs. People may fly someplace for entering a clinical trial or eligibility, and that cost may not be covered. People may have to pay a babysitter at home. People may have to drive. In some situations, we do allow that. So I just want to point that out because I think, obviously I think we're going to talk and get into an issue here about a little bit of different scenario. But the idea that some people have to incur something financially to participate in research is not a totally new idea and isn't, I don't think, is not unacceptable. Certainly something that we have to look at and to what regard and what extreme.
Thank you, Susan. I appreciate your comments. We're going to go next to Arthur Kaplan. Arthur Kaplan is an endowed professor and founding head of the division of medical ethics at NYU School of Medicine in New York City. He's the author or editor of 35 books and more than 800 papers in peer-reviewed journals. His most recent book is Getting to Good Research Integrity in Biomedicine. He has served on a number of national and international committees, including as chair of the National Cancer Institute's Biobanking Ethics Working Group, chair of the Advisory Committee to the United Nations on Human Cloning, and chair of the Advisory Committee to the Department of Health and Human Services on Blood Safety and Availability. Dr. Kaplan is a recipient of many awards and honors, including the McGovern Medal of the American Medical Writers Association, the Franklin Award from the City of Philadelphia, the Patricia Price Brown Prize in Biomedical Ethics, the Innovation Award by the Reagan Udall Foundation for the FDA, and the Public Service Award from the National Science Foundation, National Science Board, which honors individuals and groups that have made substantial contributions to increasing public understanding of science and engineering in the United States. He also holds 7 honorary degrees from colleges and medical schools. Arthur, great to see you again. Always a pleasure to interact with you. Basically, same question to you. Your definition of pay-to-pay for a clinical trial.
Well, thanks, Tony. My mother thanks you for that introduction. That was very kind. So I don't agree particularly, I agree, excuse me, with Susan pretty much on her analysis of what pay-to-play trials are. There's a huge spectrum. They run from situations where individuals have very rare diseases, don't think they can command sort of government funding or even foundation funding, are eager to see research proceed. Let's describe these often as orphan diseases. They want to get their children enrolled in something. They're often people with means, wealthy, often in the US, I might add, not in other nations particularly. And they basically come to an agreement with an individual researcher to say, if we give you the money, maybe out of our own pocket, could you launch a study on this rare disease for a drug or a gene therapy trial or whatever? At the far end of the spectrum, the other end are crooks and shysters who run around touting remedies that they sometimes advance as research or vague about it, sometimes in the US, sometimes not. And they say you have to pay us to get in here to get access to these things that I believe they know don't work, and would be very surprised if anybody actually got better. That notion of pay to play at the far end has been around for a long time. I'm so old, I remember Laetrile with people playing clinics to go get cancer therapies that were vaguely touted as experimental or innovative or just being available because the cruel FDA wouldn't let you get cured, so they wouldn't approve it. So it's not a new phenomena at that end of the spectrum. And somewhere in the middle is a weird zone, which I'm sure we're going to talk quite a bit about, where people are asked to pay something for a variety of reasons. The grant is inadequate, or they want to do a registry, or they want to do a follow-up. And it lets me mention something that Susan didn't. One of the issues that comes up, and Lee may have insight into this later, but I've always worried that pay-to-play trials going outside the normal peer review mechanisms always raise questions about the validity or the solidity of the science. In other words, you're not getting a lot of eyeballs on the proposal. Even when a desperate family says to a particular researcher, would you conduct a study of gene therapy on my child dying of some disease, some rare genetic disease, they are taking the researcher at face value. They're putting their faith in what the researcher is saying. That may make sense. It may be estimable and solid research, but nonetheless, we know historically researchers can talk themselves into the validity of what they're doing past what the evidence would warrant. We try to have review to somewhat balance off that psychological, emotional, maybe conflict of interest situation. So one problem I see in the definition of pay to play is the scientific merit of what is being done is more up for debate than it might be in peer-reviewed standard trials.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Arthur. That's excellent comments. Thank you so much. So I'm going to then now go to ask the same question from Nancy King. So Nancy is the Director of Jurisprudence, a lawyer. She's a professor in the Department of Social Sciences and Health Policy. She's co-director of the Center for Bioethics, Health and Society, and also the Bioethics Graduate Program at Wake Forest University. Her scholarship addresses a range of bioethics issues, including informed consent, benefit and uncertainty in healthcare and research, the development and use of novel experimental biotechnologies, international cross-cultural questions in human subjects research, and equity and justice in health and care and research. She has published over 100 scholarly articles and book chapters, is co-editor of 3 textbooks, The Social Medicine Reader from Duke University Press, Beyond Regulations, Ethics in Human Subjects Research from UNC Press, and Bioethics, Public Moral Argument and Social Responsibility from Routledge Press. Professor King teaches a variety of courses in bioethics, medical humanities, and research ethics to medical students and faculty and graduate students in bioethics and the health sciences, and has taught bioethics in national and international settings. She's a fellow of the Hastings Center and has served on hospital ethics committees, IRBs, data safety monitoring boards, the NIH Recombinant DNA Advisory Committee, and the Department of Health and Human Services Secretary's Advisory Committee for Human Research Protections. So Nancy, you and Susan have both served in the DHHS committee that actually looked at this very topic, pay to play for clinical trials. So again, a question to you, basic question. From your perspective, what does a pay to play trial mean to you?
Well, thank you, Tony. Just to pick up a little farther on what Susan and Art have already said, I would just add that, when SACHARP started the process of looking at this as a question, I didn't see any rationale for pay to participate trials. But became convinced by the discussions that we had over a long period of time that it was actually worth considering some very rare circumstances in which payment might be appropriate. And and first of all, I think the most important thing when we're talking about pay to participate trials is paying for the experimental intervention. Because as Susan pointed out, there are lots of ways in which many patients who are research subjects end up having to pay because of, even because of Medicare rules for payment for things that are provided in a trial that one would ordinarily have to pay for if it was the exact same thing provided outside of the research context. So this is not unprecedented, but actually paying for the experimental intervention is the key factor. And I think that there's a very limited role for that. IRBs have to be extremely careful, and the issue of scientific review is extremely important. But given the constraints on funding and even maybe the idiosyncrasies of study sections that are reviewing research protocols, there may every once in a while be something important that kind of slips through or falls just under the funding cap that might be worth IRBs taking a very careful look at. And that means IRBs might have to do a lot more in the area of scientific review than they're accustomed to doing. The other thing that's really important, I think, about pay to participate trials is that paying to participate should really only obtain in very early research. Nobody should ever say we've got a phase 3 randomized controlled trial that we want people to pay for, because by that time you ought to have data that are good enough to convince some funder and not leave it up to just the subjects. So pay to participate trials should be looked at in a very, very narrow context and very carefully.
That's great. Thank you so much, Nancy. Appreciate your comments as well. And now we'll go to our last panelist, Dr. Lee Turner. And Dr. Turner is okay with us skipping his bio because of the time constraints. So we're going to go straight to Dr. Turner and go ahead and ask the same question, basically. Lee?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think of pay to participate studies as being one where many of us know that if you go to a hospital for any reason, you might pay for parking, maybe you need to pay for a lunch. There could be expenses like that. If you're coming from a rural area, it can be even more expensive. Pay to participate studies, scholarship on this topic, typically people are paying as a condition of being in a study. That's kind of the transaction. It could be thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars. There's been some of hundreds of thousands of dollars, like $285,000. That's an outlier, but it can be modest amounts of money. It can be someone's life-saving. There are individuals who sell their house and try and cobble together resources to participate in these studies. I think that there have been efforts to say maybe there's this sort of narrow carve-out category where it may be warranted under carefully circumscribed under carefully defined circumstances to charge individuals to participate in this study. My concern is that the part of the world that I look at, businesses that are selling stem cell treatments, it's that kind of careful overview isn't taking place. And I think something we need to be aware of is that, yes, a study in which research participants are being charged or will be charged, it may go to an IRB that is scrupulous and vigilant and asks all kinds of challenging questions and asks, why people are being charged to participate and are there other ways of kind of cobbling together resources. But it's also possible for parties to engage in IRB shopping and kind of rummage around until they get the approval that they want. And in fact, if they can't go and find the IRB that gives them the kind of ethical and regulatory fig leaf to do as they please, they may just create their own IRB of like-minded individuals who then offer a kind of rubber stamp of approval. And so this is where I think we have to think very carefully about IRBs and how easy it is to basically do end runs around kind of an IRB system of oversight. That it's when it comes to pay to participate studies and the problematic aspects of them, IRBs are often front and center in terms of the problematic activity. If you think about businesses here in the United States that have been caught out selling unlicensed, unproven stem cell interventions, many of them were conducting clinical studies where people were charged to participate, and the IRB didn't approve that. There was no review, but they did find an IRB that was able to grant approval. And I think in hindsight, we can ask, how did that happen? What was the rationale for those approvals? But I think it shows the extent to which the IRB itself can be problematic, and in some cases, I would even say that it's corrupted.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Lee. That's a great comment because this is actually a nice segue to a very important question. Is it feasible for a thoughtful IRB to identify and apply the necessary criteria to justify asking potential research subjects to pay to participate in a trial? Is it feasible? We'll go back to Susan Kornetsky.
I think we've started to answer that question. I do think it's feasible. And I can't emphasize enough the issue of the scientific justification and really looking at why it's being done, what the rationale is, what void it's trying to fill, or whether this is just, the 10th trial and someone sort of disguising that as research, but those money, to and charge people. So I think that is a really important consideration. And I'm not so sure, IRBs sort of can handle this in different ways. And how much do they get into the science? How much do they rely? How much do they push an investigator back to really demonstrate that? Or do they just take it on face value that's it? So that would be the first step that I think would absolutely be essential, understanding all of that. Once you understand that, then I think there are other issues that might come up and could come up. Equitable subject selection, issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I think the IRB feels, more comfortable and can consider those things. But that first step is I think the really difficult one.
Thank you, Susan. I appreciate that answer. So, it's interesting because we're talking about all these different factors that need to be considered. So, Arthur, what additional considerations would they need to concentrate on, IRBs that is, to determine if a study could be approved from your perspective?
Well, again, a couple points, themes that are starting to emerge. For one, do they have the adequate scientific competency to really do the review? Some of these studies are in frontier areas, let's put it that way. I was trying to come up with a polite word, far out on the edge sometimes. And, the IRBs are made up variably of people with different skill sets and competency. There's some of them willing to bring in consultants or advisors to help them. Some don't have the resources to do it. So that becomes a question about, do you have the right skill set? Some IRBs balk even at getting into it with regard to the adequacy of the scientific protocol. I think it's well within their responsibility to assess that and make sure that no one is put at risk for answering questions that can't be answered by the study or the study design, but sometimes they don't want to do it. There are also IRBs that are going to be faced with these questions that don't have a lot of experience because they're in countries where there just isn't a lot of research done, but somebody may decide to set up a program in a particular place and take advantage of some, let's call it IRB shopping, where they hunt for a favorable IRB, or has been said, the last issue, they compose an IRB and basically are paying it to get the answer that they want. Some IRBs these days have a different issue. It's kind of understudied, but they want to bring research to their institution because it will command attention or media attention or prestige. It generates up a little bit of a conflict of interest. So they think, we could be the place where this pay-to-play research gets done, but what's really important is it's a cutting-edge study of something or other. It'll draw real attention to us from our alumni or from the media or peer groups outside the institution, and they may want to bring it in-house for those reasons, even if it's a little squirrely.
Yeah, very interesting. So, we're gonna chat a little bit about some of these things. Shopping for IRBs. I mean, this is something that probably for a lot of the members of this that are attending today, they're probably saying, "What do you mean you can shop for an IRB?" Right? So, Nancy King, you have been involved in some of these regulatory aspects for IRBs, like Susan Kornetsky has at the governmental level. Can you give us a little bit of an insight? What's going on? What is it? What can you really go shopping for IRBs, and how are we going to make sure that that doesn't happen anymore?
Well, yeah, the problem of IRB shopping is actually has shown up in a variety of places, and there are barriers to stopping it, having to do with information sharing. I actually think that actually Lee raised some issues in his first comment that are really important about the IRB system and oversight of the IRB system. There should be more communication between and among IRBs. There should be ways to find out where an investigator has previously sent protocols that's not really possible now, and it should be. My concern, I guess, is that saying that pay-to-play protocols should be off the table because of that will make it look like we're solving the problem, but the problem goes far beyond this kind of protocol. And you know, Art's comment about the interests of the institution where the IRB is housed is also significant. I think that really there are issues about IRB oversight that really do need to be addressed better, that go beyond pay to participate trials. But you know, IRBs who are trying to be thoughtful about pay to participate trials, even if they lack scientific expertise and need to find it elsewhere and maybe don't even know where elsewhere to go to find it, can ask one really important question of anybody who's submitting a pay-to-play protocol to them, which is, where's your preclinical data? Because most of these studies have managed to avoid collecting any preclinical data, and that is a red flag if ever there was one.
You know, you bring up an excellent point. I mean, since when do we start using these technologies straight in humans, right? I mean, this is one of the major challenges that we are facing in so many different areas, and you know, clinics basically popping up everywhere, like Lee mentioned, that have been using therapy. I'm totally improving therapies for for conditions that have never even been tested preclinically. That's a challenge. Lee, I'll turn it to you, because, you know, what do you think? What information, what additional considerations, informations would IRBs need to concentrate on to determine if, in fact, these studies can be approved from your perspective?
Sure. I mean, I'll try and build on comments we've already heard. I find this, you know, when I think about this, I think about those questions that, you know, IRBs ought to be looking at the study, details of the study, and then they also need to kind of widen their lens and look beyond that to a broader context. So let me just give you a bit of a sense of that broader context. So this is not just looking at the informed consent forms. It's not just looking at the protocol. You know, as Nancy mentioned, I mean, if there's no preclinical research, for example, I mean, for me, that's kind of like, what is there to talk about? I mean, what's the IRB supposed to discuss? Why is this going into human beings? What's charging people? Why is it even happening? So that to me is a pretty profound red flag. Here are some broader contextual details that I think IRBs, even if it's not what they ordinarily do, need to do. You know, if it's a facility that is charging for individuals to be in the study, and they've got a YouTube platform, a YouTube channel where they're pumping out all of the stem cell treatments that they're selling for dozens of diseases and injuries. If they have a Twitter feed where they're trolling for patients, trolling for clients, talking about all the fantastic stem cell therapies they've got. If they have a website where they routinely put out and pump out testimonials about, again, these you know, really promising, encouraging stem cell therapies they've got, that's not going to be baked into the protocol. But I mean, that's something that IRB needs to look at, because you may have an informed consent form that, you know, is kind of frank and forthright about risks and is very cautious about benefits. But the larger envelope of information being put out by that business is, you know, look, we are selling stem cell treatments. They're safe, they're effective, they're encouraging. You don't usually see the language of cures. But I mean, if that's the rhetoric that's being used, if that's the framing that's taking place, we shouldn't be shocked when individuals, whether they're patients or research participants, think that they are paying for access to this stem cell therapy that is going to help them or is going to help their child with autism spectrum disorder or cerebral palsy or some other kind of indication. So I think those are details. That's not, you know, a job that an IRB may ordinarily have, looking and saying, what is this place? Who are these individuals? But, you know, I think those are relevant considerations. I think it's also fair to say, okay, if someone is putting forward a phase 1 study, and with some of these businesses, you know, maybe it's a phase 1 study with 3,000 research subjects who are being charged. What's that? But, you know, you can ask the question of, okay, if this is a phase 1 study, why is this business already marketing this investigational product, which is how we should think about it? Why is it already being sold as a stem cell therapy? What about while the study is taking place? You know, why does it look as though they're going to also be selling it outside the study while this so-called study is underway? Is this study going to make any kind of difference if their plan is to just keep on selling it anyway? So those are sort of some of the contextual details And then there's the more fundamental things that IRB should have an easier time dealing with, like who is this person that's packaging themselves as a stem cell researcher but has no credible background in stem cell research, or who has published in predatory junk journals, or has put together a study with all kinds of, kind of red flags, open label, unblinded, not randomized, where it looks as though people may think that they're coming into this, they're paying to get access to a stem cell therapy. And there are these problems with deception and therapeutic misconception. So I think those are some of the issues or concerns that IRBs need to be looking at, with these businesses and also with these studies.
Sounds good. Thank you. And you bring up an interesting point because one of the if you're doing an FDA phase 1 clinical trial, of course there is a non-randomization in some of these small trials, right? They're non-random. So there's certain features that actually cross over that are difficult to ascertain when it comes to some of these trials because of the way that the nature of the trials are done. So that's also an important point that you bring up. Susan, probably, I must say you've been, involved with Primer for so many years on the board. You were the chair of Primer. You really helped establish a lot of the guidelines and a lot of the teaching tools actually that are being used today nationwide for IRBs, which, by the way, I kind of resent because I have to take that test for so many hours all the time, but electronically, but it's a good thing to do. But honestly, how can an IRB take into consideration some of the issues that you've brought up? Fair subject selection, equitable access to research, issues related to diversity and inclusion when there's a pay to participate model. How do you make sure that all those things are in place if the trial does qualify indeed for that model?
Right. So I will say from my experience, so many of the questions that you're asking are very contextual, and one protocol is one protocol. And what I mean by that is the way that you would think about, equity, diversity, population, may vary. It may vary on sort of the phase of the trial. Is this a phase 1 pilot trial, or are we recruiting, 100 people? And we would also look to, the analysis and whatever. So I think that you need to go, step by step. I think one of the, the comments that, Lee brought up when he talked about how's an IRB supposed to know that. I mean, IRB is supposed to think about what would be an alternative. One of the things is what is an alternative for that subject? And so through inquiring that, the concept that Lee said, can you get this without being in the study? Is someone else doing this? Can you get it during the study? So I think some of the things that he brought up, IRBs absolutely should and look at it, especially if there are going to be, charges associated with that. The equity and diversity thing is a big ongoing discussion. IRBs have always had the charge to make sure that subject selections are equitable and the rights, the risks and benefits are equally distributed. And that's an issue when we are limiting research to only those who can cover certain charges. And I'm not even talking about the full pay to play that we're, for the experimental therapy. That's a big issue. And it's an issue that IRBs are dealing with more and more. I don't have the answer to that, but I will say that asking those who are submitting research protocols for justification and pressing a lot further on those issues of concern is beginning to sensitize the community that some of these things may not be appropriate for those reasons. So it's, but everything is within the context of a protocol. There's never a one size fits all. So what you might be able to get by for justification for one protocol would absolutely not apply in another. So you need well functioning, I'm fortunate I work with an IRB, and a lot of us do with academic IRBs that do think about these things. I am concerned about some of the things that Dan brought up and some of the other issues about other IRBs who are not going to think about those things.
Great. Thank you, Susan. So Arthur, your thoughts on this topic as well. You've dealt with this topic in so many different areas, right? Organ transplantation and availability of organs. That's been a major area that you covered for so many years. So, you've been very sensitized to this topic over time. Any thoughts about this?
I do want to mention one other area that we need to pay attention to. Not every pay-to-play study cares if it's reviewed by an IRB. So there are people who will offshore. I'm thinking of the study that was done in a hotel room of herpes vaccine in the Caribbean. The idea behind that was you come down here and pay, travel down here if you're rich. And if this thing looks like it doesn't kill anybody, we'll give it to you. There are enterprises like that were definitely considering stem cell activity, that they don't care if an IRB reviews them. You fly to the nation where it is and get access, and they're not planning to do interstate commerce in the United States, so they do what they want to do offshore. That puts me in mind of something that has been important in the transplant field, which is what the journal editors are saying. So for many years, I've been bemoaning the fact that in China, people are killed to get their organs. And the way you can respond to that is to say, well, then the journals aren't going to accept articles based upon data that seems to come out of China, where there may have been murder to get people's organs to transplant to others. Similarly, I think journals have to make it clear that they're not going to disseminate information about non-IRB approved, off the books kind of activities. Not that that's going to solve everything. There are plenty of people willing to still make money and say to hell with it, but it's another level of, if you will, oversight or input that can be very important. And one other comment, I do think the professional society should be up there loud and vocal condemning what they see as wrong and giving information to people about, what's dangerous, what's a ripoff. Some time ago, I tried to work with one of the societies, and they were threatened with lawsuits and backed down and just said, well, we can't fight that. Well, that's got to be fixed. Professional society shouldn't be getting censored by bullies with money who threaten to litigate against them. So there are other pathways or agents. First, we've got to recognize some of this stuff is not IRB reviewed. Investigators have no interest. They don't intend to publish anything anywhere, and they don't really care other than getting the money for whatever it is they want to promote. Countries put up with it and let them do it around the world. And then journals, and I would argue professional societies, have rules too.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Art. Nancy, thoughts at your end? And you brought up so many important points. It's amazing, right? I mean, just to think that the first statement you started out with, people are being murdered, being killed to get organs. I mean, we have so many issues that we have to deal with. Nancy, your thoughts at your end? Same question.
Well, I think I'm going to take the issue of equitable subject selection a little further in this particular context and say that I actually don't think there are many significant differences between people who can afford to participate in a pay-to-play trial and people who can't. So I don't think equitable subject selection means what it sort of standardly means in this context. I think what's at issue is therapeutic misconception and the exploitation of very vulnerable subjects. And what that has to do with then is a lot of the things that we have already talked about. And it's not enough to say, I'm not saying we shouldn't worry about equitable subject selection, because as Lee has pointed out, people are willing to do almost anything to get into a trial, including, starting a GoFundMe page and selling important assets. But I think the issue really is exploitation of vulnerable subjects. And what that means is that one of the things that IRBs should attempt to make certain investigators are actually doing in pay-to-play trials is fostering the ability of potential subjects to actually make decent decisions that reflect their own best interests. Now, that takes two forms. The SAC-HARP set of recommendations includes a list of questions that potential subjects should always be asking of investigators, which is from the subject's perspective, the kinds of things we've been talking about. What evidence do you have? You know, why are you asking me to pay? What exactly am I going to be paying for, et cetera? So helping subjects make better decisions, even subjects for whom nothing else has worked, who are seeking participation in early phase trials out of the hope that it might actually help them. That hope is okay if it's not overwhelming everything else, and the answers to these kinds of questions may actually help in that regard. The other thing is to promulgate those kinds of questions more widely through professional societies, through ISSCR and other avenues, so that everybody knows that if you're tempted to participate in a pay-to-play trial, you should be asking a lot of questions to determine whether there is any likelihood that it could possibly benefit you. And you really need to understand the difference between a proven therapy and taking part in a very early phase trial that is intended to begin the process of determining whether the intervention should be regarded as therapeutic at a later time.
Thank you, Nancy. All very good points. And you know, we're going to get a little bit into this in the next set of questions when we start to talk about, you know, what really should be done for, you know, in terms of considerations for patients. Lee, any additional comments regarding this question in terms of the issues we've mentioned: subject selection, equitable access to research, diversity, equity, inclusion?
Sure, I can say a little bit. I mean, I think Nancy makes a number of good points that we really need to be focused on the possibility for exploitation, taking advantage of vulnerable individuals in difficult circumstances, like threatening diseases, for example. I think we need to be very concerned about therapeutic misconception, especially if individuals conducting the study are not just, you know, it's not just that it's sort of unfortunately happening. If representations are being put out that are attempting to persuade people that they're getting access to a therapy, we probably shouldn't use the language of therapeutic misconception. I mean, maybe more like therapeutic misrepresentation, where it's a deliberate effort to obscure and confuse and conflate. Those are important issues. But in terms of, you know, sort of who gets access into pay to participate studies, I mean, the phrase is no joke. If you don't pay, you don't participate, you don't get in there. And so that can be a constraint in terms of who gets access to these studies. I've done quite a bit of work with Professor Jeremy Snyder at Simon Fraser University, and we've looked at crowdfunding campaigns. And you can, you know, make connections between online crowdfunding campaigns at GoFundMe and elsewhere, and a number of these pay to participate studies where people will go online and they're desperately trying to raise sufficient funds to go to a place that they think will help them or will help their child. And I would say that, you know, when someone has to pay $15,000 or $20,000, that can be a real constraint, that they think they're gaining access to something that's going to help them. Many individuals, of course, don't have those resources. And so that's why they're looking to neighbors, friends, strangers. We do have another way of funding medical research and allowing access to clinical studies where I think these issues are not as pressing, not as difficult. And I'm thinking about patient advocacy organizations and various disease kind of related organizations where it's not just, you know, we don't just have a world of either you get NIH funding or you don't have anything and you have to go and try and charge your research subjects to participate in the study. I mean, we have other sources of funding like patient advocacy groups, patient advocacy foundations, where the funding may go to that organization. They can then play a role in funding a study. And with many of the studies that I can think of in that context, the research participants themselves are not charged to participate. And if there's someone of limited financial means, if there are parents who, you know, there's credible reasons to have their child in a particular study, but they can't pay for it, they're not charged to have those individuals in that study. So there are other funding models that I think can play a role in supporting worthwhile, credible research, where the burden of payment is not falling directly on individual patients or research participants or parents. It's part of this larger community, and that can do a lot to promote more equitable modes of access to participating in clinical studies. So I would just say that, there are a variety of funding models, and I think that there are others that don't bring all the baggage, the many ethical, scientific, and regulatory issues that often come along with pay-to-participate studies.
Excellent point, Lee. Thank you. Thank you for bringing that up. There are alternatives out there, that can be explored for sure. So, right now, one of the, let's move on to the consent process, because, this is actually, of course, patient beware, right? And we need to make sure patients are always aware of what they're getting into when they enter into a clinical trial. So, Susan, and I'm going to ask this question, what implications does the pay-to-participate funding model have in the consent process?
So I think it has a lot. And I think that once we can get through some of these other discussions and people feel comfortable, then the attention to the informed consent process. And I'm saying even beyond just the form, the whole process is important. I think this idea of people, understanding, that this is, I think this idea of a therapeutic misconception or whatever is real. I think when people pay for things, subjects also have more expectations about the control of what happens. I think there are implications for if you really believe in something and paying for something, are you adequately reporting adverse events, self-report? I think there's a whole host of things that, comes along with once you get past, okay, let's do it, let's inform the individual. And, that process and how that's explained is really important. And it's not only important in explaining it, there's also an issue of how it's heard. And I think that that's a challenge, as well, all the time, that you can try and explain, this is experimental, this is your option, you need to understand, we're going to report these things. But, we've had other experiences in other areas where individuals who have paid or family foundations that have paid have also felt very enabled to, ask for certain things or say, this isn't working, or this, whatever. The other thing that I did want to bring up, and it's about the informed consent and the other type of things, is in these trials involved with the science, sort of the outcomes and how they're evaluated are really, really important. And I think that, if you have sort of subjective outlines that relies on only a parent's input, like, oh, my autistic child is doing better, they've paid, they believe that. Mm-hmm. So I think that that's another important thing to build into the science, and then, also to build into the informed consent process, everything else. So I did want to bring that up before I sort of lost that point, in addition to informed consent, and that to the science, a different aspect of how it's really being evaluated. So sorry for bringing up another issue, but I did want to point that out.
No, that's an excellent issue, Susan. Thank you for bringing it up. So Nancy, I'm going to actually skip the order right now, because I think this is an important issue. And Nancy, you've been dealing with IRBs as well in terms of oversight. So we'd love to get your input into what Susan just mentioned.
Well, I agree with everything that Susan said. And I also think that as she said, the consent form and process are important. I want to echo what Lee said about the framing of the framing surrounding a trial, which may be either from some investigators, deliberately selling what they're doing, but it also may come from the individual investigator's conviction that this thing is going to work, because many investigators are like, I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't think it was going to work. So the circumstances and the way that the information in the consent form is presented are extremely important. And one of the things I've always thought is problematic is that IRBs only review the consent form. They are not in a position to actually observe consent processes, and I wish that they were. I thought this was something that we could all get to when everybody realized that IRBs had too great a workload and looked for ways to diminish the workload. I was hoping that meant that IRBs could go out into the field of their institutions a little more. That hasn't happened, although I think it should. What I think is also important, though, is that Lee's point about other funding mechanisms actually becomes really important, because to counteract the therapeutic misconception is getting increasingly difficult, because it isn't just potential subjects who may have the therapeutic misconception. It's investigators, it's IRBs, it's everybody who just really wants something to work because that's the best way they can think of to help people. So, and we also have the right to try, and we have this sort of simultaneous incredible optimism about science and skepticism about science, so that people who are suffering from rare disorders may think, well, you know, the best thing I can do is enroll in research because it might help. Now, if those other funding mechanisms from patient advocacy groups and foundations and so forth look at a trial and say, hey, we're not going to help anybody enroll in this trial because it really doesn't meet the standards that we have for producing good results, and that's what this is about, producing results that can go on to the next phase of research, then that information should be widely promulgated, and it should be made available, and potential subjects should be doing their research and finding out that their patient advocacy group is not helping people to enroll in this pay-to-participate trial because it doesn't meet good standards. And we generally have to continue to do a better job of educating the public about the important differences between research and treatment. Even though there are similarities, and maybe those similarities are increasing, there are really important differences that often go unappreciated, and the consent form and process should help to address that, but it can't carry all the weight here.
Nancy, thank you again. Many, you bring up another range of issues which are important and all relevant, all very relevant. So, Arthur, your thoughts on this topic?
Well, I'm going to say something that is not grounded in any study or data, but I think is probably true, which is that the model for consent is, I'll present you with an opportunity, you'll hear the risks and benefits, you'll think about whether you want to contribute to knowledge, you'll understand all your options of dropping out or finding out the results. I don't think that's pay to play. I mean, I think people in pay-to-play settings are basically saying, I'm desperate, I'm eager to do something, I want to find something that might help me or benefit me. I don't think there's a horde or a posse of altruists running around saying, oh, I'd love to sign up for research. It's just, you know, I want to sign up for things where I might get to pay. So I think it's more likely that they're, you know, hunting for something that they kind of have this hope may benefit them. If you want to call it the therapeutic misconception, okay. I just think they're looking for something that might be a promising trial that they could get into, and the only way it seems to them to find it is to go to the pay-to-play option. So I'm very skeptical that consent is a good protection. Just very skeptical. I think it falls back to the IRBs again. But if I'm right, and again, I have no data, this is all sort of hunch, then one solution here to think about is to start to insist on subject advocates, like we do in organ donation for living donation, when people are a little uncertain about motivation or why somebody might be donating a kidney. We ask for an independent advisor to interact with people to make sure that they really are listening to all the information before they donate a kidney or maybe sign on to participate. Having said that, I'm going to reiterate, I still am not a fan of relying on informed consent for pay-to-play studies. I think the people are just often too eager, too desperate, too hopeful, too willing to want to get in there. If somebody says to me, well, you know, it's going to cost you $50,000 to get into this, it's not like I sit around and say, well, let me think about the risk and the benefit and decide whether, I mean, these are people who are looking for something, want to, are oriented toward doing it. So it's got to be the scientific profession, the medical profession, the IRBs, the journals, the professional societies that police. In my view, I don't know that you're going to be able to just say, well, they consented.
So an interesting point, Arthur, and maybe we'll, you know, I do want to get back to this point because I think that's an important point, and we'll get back to Susan and Nancy on that. But before we do that, Lee, additional comments in the consent process, and then I'm going to go back to Susan and Lee and Nancy.
Sure. I mean, maybe what I can do is kind of, you know, move a bit beyond the consent framing, and so, you know, some of the core elements of consent. It's about honesty. It's about forthrightness. It's about being kind of frank to individuals. It's, you know, providing people with information that they can use to make informed choices. But you know, forthrightness, honesty, transparency matter in other domains. And so, you know, when you think about pay to participate studies, there's a lot of evasiveness, there's a lot of shiftiness, there's a lot of failure to disclose, even that people are going to end up having to pay to participate in various studies. And so that's something that I think is maybe worth mentioning as well. That, you know, with many studies where individuals are being charged to participate, that's not disclosed on clinicaltrials.gov. You know, it's not mentioned there. So there are instances where people, for example, have gone to clinicaltrials.gov listing, you know, found a study that's listed by Stengenics or some other business, and they think that they're gaining access to a, you know, sort of regular study where people aren't being charged. And it's only partway through the pitch that they realize that they're going to have to pay to be in that study. So not all of these pay to participate studies, it's not as though that's kind of clearly described at the very beginning. You have to go well down a road before you begin to realize that, in fact, you're going to be paying to be in a study. So often there's a failure to disclose it there. There are other instances where people are being charged to participate in studies, and then an investigative journalist or someone comes along and starts asking questions, and the individuals involved deny that any of the subjects are being charged. And so there seems to be, you know, an unwillingness to have a kind of frank discussion that people are being charged. It's one thing to have a discussion where we talk about the merits and limitations of pay to participate studies. It's a very different thing when people are trying to conceal and obscure and deflect and not be forthright about what they're doing. And I mentioned this in part. I mean, you know, you and I have had many emails going back and forth about a study that was published in CELLS Translational Medicine. And that's one where, again, you know, sort of take us beyond consent, where, you know, here we have a study where it's a business in Panama where people are being, you know, paying $7,200 to be involved in a study. The clinicaltrials.gov listing says people are being charged for that study and they have to pay expenses. My colleague Jeremy Snyder and I wrote a piece for your journal where we kind of, you know, pointed out that in the article itself, they didn't disclose that people were being charged $7,200 to participate in that study. That's important information that not just participants in a study need to know, but journal readers need to know. People need to be aware that individuals are being charged. As Susan pointed out, if parents of children with autism spectrum disorder are filling out a form and assessing their child, readers deserve to know that parents paid to have their child participate in that study. That's important information. Maybe paying frames how people think about the study, how they think about their child is doing in the study. Readers need to be aware of that. In the case of that particular one, you know, the authors have gone on and said that no, you know, research participants weren't charged. This is just for travel-related expenses. And as you and I know from our exchanges, I mean, there are parents who say that they paid $7,200 to this business. The business itself used to have on its website that it was a partially patient-funded study. You know, there are investigative reporters who've gone and talked to parents who said that they paid $7,200 to be in the study, 1,800 installments, 4 installments. So there are many sources of evidence pointing out that people did pay to participate in the study, and yet, you know, it wasn't disclosed. And when the authors were criticized, they denied, you know, the very fact that people were being charged to participate in this study, even though there's substantial body of evidence pointing out that that's exactly what took place. So this is where we're not just talking about consent. I would say we're having an across-the-board failure to be forthright and honest and transparent about what's going on. That's a problem not just for research participants, that's a problem for the larger world of biomedical research. I think there are important details that are often not being shared, whether it's with journal editors or reviewers, but certainly at the end of the pipeline with readers. And quite frankly, I think that's indefensible.
Hey, Tony, can I just ask a question? Lee may know, I don't know, others may know. Do we have any information about satisfied subjects in pay-to-play studies relative to the denominator? And the secondary question is, do we have any information about whether they generated anything worthwhile in terms of science? I mean, if you ask me, I have no knowledge of anybody saying, boy, that was one heck of a valuable pay-to-play study. That doesn't mean there isn't. I don't know of any.
Right. I don't know either, actually. I think you're asking a very important question, because this is a very important area to look into. What are the interesting thing is, if you're going to pay for something, you're probably, it's like what has been mentioned by the panelists, is you probably already have a perceived advantage that you're going to see because you pay for something, like what has been mentioned today. And so all these points are important. I think these are things that need to be looked at very, very carefully. And I know there was a panel, of course, there was a government panel that discussed this extensively for pay-to-play. So I don't know if Nancy or Susan, you were part of that panel. Arthur is asking a very important question. So maybe you all have some insights into that.
Well, I think that if anybody has data, it might be FDA, since FDA has actually permitted at least partial payment for investigational interventions, especially investigational devices. They require a strong justification, but this has been the case for some years. So if there are such data, FDA might have it.
I would agree to that, and I think that's something that has come up in the past, that the device world, FDA regulations does allow that that someone pay for that. Now, in a lot of situations, I think clinicians can work with insurance companies, at least in the United States, to pay for that. But we have definitely had device trials where we, as an IRB, have brought that up and said, well, what if this person's insurance won't pay? What do we do? Do we say you can't participate or not? So, and even in the drug world, although most investigational drugs are not charged for, there is a mechanism to apply to FDA to charge for that. So I think, FDA, and whether people are satisfied or dissatisfied is an interesting question, whether that has any, influence.
Very good. So maybe, a follow-up question on this, because as you know, and I do believe disclosure is so important at every level, right? And at the consent level, at the patient-doctor relationship level, at the publication level, like Lee just mentioned, there's so many areas where disclosure is so important. So getting back to the comment before, because I think this is such an important issue. Last question on IRBs and consent forms before we move on to the actual clinical trials. But what are the special considerations then that we need to allow for in a pay-to-participate trial in the consent process? Basically, based on what has just been mentioned by Leonard and the comments that have been made to this point, Susan. I know it's a very, very, very difficult question to answer, but I'd love to see what you have to say.
Well, I was interested in Art's comment about, in pay-to-play, in informed consent, what is the role there? People are looking for that. I would argue that that gets at the vulnerability issue that Nancy, brought up, that even if you don't pay, I think there are people who go into an informed consent process with blinders on, or not maybe blinders on, but because of the hope. It's the only thing. So, I think, what he brought up is sort of calling into question a big issue in informed consent. And so I'm not singling out saying informed consent, we can't do that, and pay-to-play doesn't make any sense. These people are paying, they're going. I would argue that goes, further. to desperate individuals, whether it's oncology, whether it's rare diseases, other types of things. There are people who just, you know, that's they feel that's their only hope for whatever reason, right or wrong. Obviously, with pay to pay, they're paying for something, but that's an informed consent process. I don't know, Tony, you know, to answer your question, you know, what do we do? I'm just potentially saying, some of this is just embedded in, you know, the problematic issues about informed, you know, consent, and, you know, Art's idea or Nancy's idea about, you know, having the idea that IRBs don't participate or part of that. They can by regulation, they can observe any part of the research. They should. There are models, you know, to do that. There are models in research. I'm familiar with one that we use that's more of an advocate, that someone goes in for higher risk or protocols that we're concerned about people having therapeutic misconception, and speaks with the subject after to assure an uninvolved person to assure that that they are understanding as best we can what they are. So there are models, and maybe that's some of the solution, although that's resource intensive.
Thanks, Susan. Nancy, any comments on that question?
Yeah, just to add to that just a little bit, I think many institutions actually have a position called research subject advocate, who should be made better use of in protocols exactly like Susan is highlighting, because, you know, Art's point about the need for decision support, the need for advocacy for people making decisions about research participation is extremely important, and probably should be used more widely. I think what's also important, though, is that it's never just about, oh, well, they consented and that's enough. In the context that we're talking about a lot of work to get to the point where informed decision making is the next step. So ideally, we're talking about research that has been adequately scrutinized, isn't something that has just ginned up an IRB to approve it. So we're talking about the ideal circumstance here. And so consent maybe comes in the middle. It comes at the end of the process of examining whether a particular trial can go forward and with whom. And then after that come all the processes like review by journal editors, promulgation of appropriate information by all the other authorities that we're talking about. And in there somewhere also are the points Lee's making about information on clinicaltrials.gov. I mean, it takes a village to put all this together to make it possible for potential subjects to make decisions that are justifiable and in their best interests as they understand them. So consent is a really important part of all of this. And one of the problems is that we have a tendency to rely too heavily on consent when the other things that we've been talking about are not present, and that's a bigger system problem.
Thank you, Nancy. I appreciate those comments as well. So Art, let me ask you, because you know you've been involved also in the other side of the pay to play, right? Which is the side of where investigators pay participants to basically be involved in a clinical trial. So of course, it's a totally different topic, but I think it would be really a good thing to just touch on this briefly. Your thoughts on actually paying patients to participate, which is the opposite of what we're talking about right now. But you know, this webinar is called Pay to Play. So I guess you can pay to play either way. So what are your thoughts on patients paying?
It's probably another 90-minute seminar for the future. It's a complicated issue in its own right. I do want to make two comments about paying the subjects paying the investigators, and then I'll take a little swipe at the investigators paying the subjects. One is there are often ancillary expenses that accrue when you're in a study that are not commented upon by those who are saying, you pay me to be in the study. So whether it's babysitters or hotels or travel or follow-ups or whatever, costs can go up pretty quickly. I've heard people who are on the crowdsource side complain about that pretty bitterly, that they paid an X amount of money to get in the trial, but they didn't really realize that they were going to get charged. And some places will charge expenses as part of the way to make money because they own the hotel, or they own the place where you have to stay, or they own the lab that's going to do the follow-up surveillance and so on. So there are compounding problems about saying you're going to pay. It reminds me again, Tony, of organ donation. People donate tissues, and all of a sudden for-profit tissue companies are in there making extraordinary amounts of money, claiming it's just handling charges. So they're using bone or ligament or tendon, and the markups are like absurd. And we, as a society, pay those costs, but no one is in there saying those prices are gouging, or that's not a reasonable cost to associate with what you were charging. So those issues are out there. And I did want to mention one other point, which is there are occasionally rich people who say to me, I want to do what I want. I could spend my money in Atlantic City, or I can spend my money chasing around preventive cures for herpes or whatever it is. Now, this is not a big subsection of the pay-to-play crowd, but their ideology is not to be ignored because it influences others, which is, I don't need anybody regulating anything I do. I got the dough, I got the means, I'll make my own damn decisions, and I don't need any Kaplan or Kronetsky's or Kings or Turners to step in between me and what I want to do. Nobody's stopping me from being a dope if I want to throw my money away in Las Vegas, and I have the right to throw my money away on Tony Atala's crazy research projects and leave me alone. So there is a certain kind of pushback that sometimes comes from the very rich who are used to getting what they want, and that shapes congressional responses, other regulator responses. You know, it's sort of like, okay, it's America, we're autonomy crazy, and you know, people will do what they want to do. They make bad decisions, lose money, waste money, kill themselves all the time. So this is more of that. And we have to acknowledge at least that that philosophy tends to be one, not my favorite, but it's out there and you got to wrangle with it a little bit. I used to be a critic of paying subjects. I thought too coercive, too distorting of their ability to make consent. I will say recent studies, one is out very recently out of Penn, shows that people aren't necessarily distorted in their thinking when they get paid to be in certain kinds of studies. Not all kinds of studies were covered, but some. And they argue that it's a little, there's almost a University of Pennsylvania position emerging, which is that it's paternalistic to tell people they can't get paid, or there has to be a limit on what they can make. Or if you say to a prisoner, you can only get paid $1 because where you are, $1 goes very far. If we gave you $100, it would coerce you, and so on. I think there are going to be situations where payment makes sense. To me, the standard is, can you show that it distorts understanding, distorts the subject's ability to give you back what the risk information is? Whenever a med student says to me, I'm going to be in that sleep study, it pays $1,000 for 3 nights. And I say, well, what are the risks? And say, I don't know. It's $1,000 for 3 nights. To me, that's trouble.
That's good. That's good. Excellent. I couldn't let that subject go. You know, I mean, I think you're right. This is another webinar opportunity here. Well, we really need to look at, but it's definitely a separate topic. But I appreciate you bringing this up as well, because that's an important thing for folks who may, you know, there's another side to the coin of this, you know, paying patients to participate in a clinical trial, and you know, where's the happy medium? Okay, so I think we've talked a lot about, you know, IRB consent form, making sure that patients are protected. Let's go to, you know, now let's go into this topic. What are the legitimate reasons for charging research subjects to participate in clinical trials? Art, well, we have you on once you go ahead, and then we'll go down to Lee and then Susan.
Sorry, Tony, you dropped. I didn't hear the question. You dropped out on me there.
Sure. Yeah. What are the legitimate reasons for charging research subjects to participate in clinical trials? What do you think which are the legitimate reasons from your perspective?
So I'll mention two. One is speed. There are subjects who say, I can't wait for peer review. I can't wait years for people to organize this trial. This guy says, or this woman says, if I can pay, they can organize the trial and get things going more quickly. As Nancy pointed out, this is often phase one, sort of getting going work, and they want to get going, and they say their kid is sick and becoming disabled, or they themselves are facing terminal illness. I've seen people say, I have to pay because I need speed, and I can't rely on the standard peer review mechanisms or expanded access that the FDA has to get me there in time. The other reason I think might be is that there are some disease areas that are basically orphan. They're not popular with the NIH or foundations, and you're sort of falling between the cracks, and nobody's ever going to study, Crab A disease or some particular storage disease, lysosomal storage disease thing. And you're like, it doesn't matter what I do, they're never going to get to me in terms of any funding. So we've got to either pay for it, or, as has been noted, raise money with a foundation or patient group or somebody to get it going.
Very good. Thank you. Thanks, Art. Lee, from your perspective, what are the legitimate reasons for charging research subjects to participate in clinical trials?
Sure. Let me try and address a cluster of questions. Art asked the question, what have the outcomes been with pay to participate studies? Are there any good outcomes? And I think that actually connects to the question you're asking. If you go back to the 1980s, when this topic really kind of first got going, a lot of the businesses that were trying to charge research participants back then, they went bankrupt. Nothing really came of their research. These were kind of failed enterprises. If you look in more recent years at stem cell businesses that have charged research participants, I would say a lot of it's been kind of junk studies that were basically marketing exercises, studies that were not that far from sort of the direct-to-consumer advertising. Some of those businesses have been subject to permanent injunctions by the FDA. They've received warning letters or untitled letters from the FDA. They become subject to class action lawsuits. In other words, it's not exactly a story of science in its splendor. These are problematic businesses doing dodgy studies. People get charged a lot of money, and then eventually a regulator comes along and does something about it. But then there's the question you're asking, which is, is there a circumscribed world of credible studies where there's legitimate reasons for charging research participants? And I would say that, according to US federal regulations, there is a kind of a carve out, right, where it is possible to conduct investigational new drug applications that are cleared by the FDA, where businesses can engage in profiteering. They can't charge $200,000 to research participants, but they can basically engage in cost recovery, where they have to go to the FDA, explain why they want to charge research participants, show that they're not engaged in profit-making behavior, but they're engaged in cost recovery. And this is typically exceptional circumstances where valuable, worthwhile scientific research cannot proceed unless the research participants are covering some of the expenses. And so this is often like really small biotech companies or startup companies that they're not really substantially capitalized, and yet the research itself is worthwhile. So I think maybe that's more the kind of scenario that you're encouraging us to think about, where the science isn't dodgy, it's not bogus, people aren't being deceived and misled, it's not sort of predatory behavior to exploiting individuals. Hopefully, if it's gone through an IRB and it's been through the FDA review and those expenses are being carefully reviewed and the FDA is allowing that to proceed, hopefully now we're talking about a different kind of world of research that's taking place. So maybe that's an example of where there's valuable, promising, credible research on a meaningful scientific basis, where it simply cannot get done unless there are some charges borne by the research participants. But I have to say, what's interesting to me about this is that here's this space where we know it's permitted by federal regulations. We know it goes on, and yet there seems to be this striking gap in terms of peer-reviewed scholarship. Like, what's going on with these studies? How much are people charged? Have these moved from phase 1 to phase 2? Has anything reached the market, via this route? And so it seems to me that that's the spot where, if we were looking for more credible, promising research, that is perhaps where it's taking place. And yet we don't really seem to have much in the public domain about what's going on there. Like, how much are people being charged? And did it go from phase 1 to phase 2? And so it seems like, there's a lot that the FDA does that it's basically, it's proprietary. It's not really enters the public domain. And I wonder if this isn't, where commercial interests have taken precedence, so that valuable information hasn't actually entered the public domain that would otherwise inform and shape our conversation. So there's that remark. The last thing I'll say, just because I know we're nearing the end, is that, there's another route we haven't really talked about, which is the expanded access pathway. And this is something that's, somewhat of a tangent, but related to this discussion, where, there seems to be a move afoot right now to charge individuals on an expanded access basis for stem cell products or other comparable interventions. And I know, one in your neck of the woods, there's a Duke and CryoCell nexus, which seems to be ramping up, and it's building an infusion clinic in the Durham area. And I want to emphasize that it's not just sort of, dodgy offshore clinics that we should be concerned about. Even elite reputable institutions, if they're using expanded access to charge individuals, at scale in large numbers, I think this raises concerning, there are concerning factors here as well that deserve close scrutiny. We don't want to have expanded access all of a sudden become the new route to the marketplace. And perhaps that's what's occurring in this case. So just to sort of toss that into the mix here.
Thanks, Lee. Thanks for bringing all those points up. And with same question, I think same thing. This is amazing, because all these different important points that are being brought up, which definitely are very relevant. And so, Susan, I'll go to you. Your thoughts. Same question.
Yeah. So pretty simple picking up. My thought would be, number one, there's no other way to do the trial. That, all alternatives out there, there's no other way. And that could be for many reasons. That could be because it's so rare. There's no interest in pediatrics. We see this all the time. You don't make money in pediatrics on rare diseases. So there have to be other mechanisms. So I think that is legitimate. And the other thing that I would say is a very careful exploration of what is being charged. How and it's not a number that's pulled out of the air. It's not a number that is profit. There is a substantial understanding of that this is what's necessary to cover those costs. And you're right, when we get involved with the FDA, there is a process to do that. There are some things that fall outside of the FDA. So, the question is who to do that. So I would say no other way. And then really make sure that we look at what the costs are and if that's reasonable.
Great, thank you, Susan. And Nancy, what are your thoughts?
Everybody has made really good points. I would just add that we're talking about very, very few instances of trials that would fall, say, outside of FDA jurisdiction, like Susan mentioned. And I think, the good science and a record of good preclinical data are both really important. I think also that we need to actually look at the problem of shrinking federal funding for good research, because I'm sure there are a lot of investigators who feel like they're kind of between a rock and a hard place, because they have what they think is good, credible design, but they may fall just below the funding cutoff. And so I think that we could say something like only very early phase research should be even considered for pay to participate, because once you have some decent data, there ought to be somebody who picks up and funds. And, that's easy for me to say because I'm not an expert in the issue of orphan diseases and other areas where funding is problematic. But I think we actually need to look at those problems and solve some of them in order to make sure that pay to participate studies remain in the very small, justifiable space.
Thank you, Nancy. You know, it's amazing. We basically are almost at the end of the session. I can't believe it. I'm just shocked. I just looked at the clock and I said, I can't believe we are here. We have another hour and a half to go to complete the topic of at hand. It's such a complicated topic. So I'm going to ask each of you then, any final comments that you want to give that you think are relevant for this pay to participate topic that we've covered today. And I'll start with you, Art.
Well, look, I agree. This is in some ways a small area of what goes on in research. I think Nancy's right about that. At the same time, it's an area that can do harm and serious harm to people because they lose money, they are disappointed, they're ripped off. And I still think for the most part, my view is pay to play is still more troubling by far than it is solid, rewarding, a wonderful approach to getting research done. It still seems to me it's loaded with problems. Part of the challenge then is to get information. I'm usually not as gung-ho as others about saying, we need more data. But I'd settle for somebody saying to me, you know what, here's 5 pay studies where they paid to play, and they were great, and they really have led to something useful. And everybody who was in them thought, yep, we paid, but the price was right. Without that, I'm leaning far over toward this is an area that has to be watched carefully because it's trouble.
Thank you, Art. Lee, comments from your end.
Well, I mean, I think we don't want to enable and foster scams and predatory behavior and conduct that takes advantage of vulnerable individuals. So I think there is a portion of the marketplace out there that deserves very close scrutiny, whether it's here in the United States involving the FDA, FTC, Department of Justice, or in other countries, other entities. But I think that's, there are some participants in this space that really need to be looked at very carefully and critically. In instances where there's a credible basis for charging research participants, and we've talked a little bit about what those models might look like, I think it's important that there are appropriate, governance structures, regulatory structures, that there's a lot of scrutiny, there's a lot of oversight, and this is being done in a cautious, transparent manner where there is good science, people aren't being taken advantage of. There's a lot more that could be said on these points. But I think that's an important consideration. The other thing I'll say is that, the story of not all good research being funded by the NIH, this is not a new situation, right? I mean, people were talking about the same thing back in the 1980s. There are always going to be good studies that are not funded by the NIH. And, there are many ways of responding to that. Maybe there needs to be more funding for biomedical research. Maybe there are other ways of funding biomedical research. I don't think we should look to participants in studies as kind of the obvious and first place to turn. And so when we're talking about funding and funding models, there are many ways of talking about this subject. And I think there are a lot of other more promising ones that are worthy of consideration than just sort of, charging individuals to be in studies. And those of us, I have an application in NIH right now. I imagine that some of you others do as well. Getting rejected, not getting funding is part of the process. We all have to kind of learn to live with that and hope that perhaps next time our number comes up. We can't just sort of think, I'm going to go out and find some individual near death's door and see if I can open up their wallet and take it. That's the part of this space that I am especially concerned about.
Great, thank you, Lee. Nancy, final comments at your end.
Okay, this is going to sound kind of Pollyannish, I think, but research is supposed to be about the search to produce good generalizable knowledge to help patients in the future. We've been talking a lot about the contrast between that and the I should be able to do whatever I want model and the this is a way to make money model. I think there's always been that enormous tension between those two manifestations, ways to think about research. I think there ought to be a lot more scrutiny and a lot more attempt to return to really considering that research is about the process of developing good generalizable knowledge in a reasonable and ethical manner. That might even include paying all research subjects something to help remind them that they are part of an enterprise that is devoted to good science. But I think pay-to-play is just one corner of the problem, and we need to do a lot more on all fronts, like everyone has really been saying.
Thank you, Nancy. And Susan, last but not least.
Final word. So I'll be quick. You know, I don't think this problem is going to go away. I think it's going to continue. I think we're going to see it in different ways and in different contexts. I think that we all have a part of the puzzle. And I think that's been alluded to here from investigators, professional associations, IRBs, journals. And, you know, in the meantime, I really think that the thing that's most important right now is transparency. And so that if this is going to continue, that we recognize it and that everyone is transparent about that. And so that's would be my final words.
Susan, thank you so much. This has been an amazing panel. I've learned a lot. I really enjoyed having this time with all of you. I really would like to thank all of you. I'd like to thank SCTM, CELLS Translational Medicine, again, for sponsoring this webinar, Anne Murphy and her team that's present. And I'd like to thank all the attendees that have made this session special for us. And finally, to really a big thanks to our panelists, Arthur Kaplan, Nancy King, Susan Kornetsky, Lee Turner. Can't thank you enough. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Tony. This was a great conversation.
Thank you, Nancy. Thanks to all of you. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Tony. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.